The Evil Within is such a polarizing series, even within its own fanbase. Despite a decent high 70 score on Metacritic and selling 3 million copies more than its sequel that it generated, the first Evil Within's reputation has paled quite a bit over the years in comparison to its more conventional and accessible sequel. In fact, if you'd only heard about the series from social media over the past 7 to 10 years, you'd likely assume that The Evil Within is just an unfocused, frustrating mess, and that The Evil Within 2 saved the series' legacy by righting all the wrongs of its predecessor. But while The Evil Within 2 is certainly a very solid game, I'd argue it didn't have nearly as much to improve as people say it did, and I'd even go so far as to say that it overcorrected to the point of losing its predecessor's edge. That edge, comprised of compelling art direction, atmosphere, and visceral action, more than makes up for loose controls or encounter design or the litany of other smaller problems that the game has. But despite these qualities, the prevailing discourse tends to have a strange hate fetish for The Evil Within, but it's just never seemed warranted to me. Now, admittedly, the criticisms of The Evil Within usually begin rationally, complaining about the annoying widescreen black bars, or frustrating one-hit kill bosses and traps, or janky controls, but gradually the decorum fades into punitive diatribes about how The Evil Within is unworthy of Mikami's pedigree, especially in regards to his last horror game in Resident Evil 4. They complain that The Evil Within's not survival horror enough, or a whole litany of exaggerated claims about how its inventory and stamina restrictions are arbitrary, when Silent Hill 2 or Signalis or The Last of Us are praised for these same types of design. And that's before we get into wild claims like the game doesn't let you save except in between levels, when the game has a frequent autosave checkpoint system as well as 3 to 4 save rooms inside of each chapter. I mean, these reviews get so nitpicky and insular that the most rational review from someone outside the industry mainstream may quite literally be Darkside Phil's. Let me repeat, Darkside Phil may have the best non-IGN, GameSpot, what have you, everyman review on the whole internet. I'm not even kidding you. It's gotten that bad out here in these streets.
It's a great game, you should check it out, but at the same time, don't get your hopes up for the savior of the survival horror universe. It's my honest opinion. I enjoyed the game, I enjoyed the graphics, the atmosphere, I enjoyed the gameplay.
Wait for it. Wait for it.
15 hours, $60, you don't get an ending. That's fucking bullshit, alright?
So, how did we get here? Well, The Evil Within seems to be the victim of understandable but completely unhelpful expectations that it couldn't really hope to live up to, and shouldn't have to. Players seem to want it to feel like the first 3 Resident Evils, but also be just as good or better than the 4th game, a tall order to measure up to considering that RE4 is considered one of the best games ever made. But Mikami and Bethesda and the industry at large were hyping this game up as a return to the genre's old ways, or return to survival horror as they called it. The only problem was that Mikami's definition of survival horror had always been different than the norm, and it had been a consistent thread for his own design philosophy, although players eventually felt that The Evil Within was too much like RE4 and yet not as good, or that it failed to bring back to the genre's roots, despite its peers being praised for using similar techniques. It was a firestorm of overambitious artist intent and wildly unreasonable audience expectation and unfairly applied standards, and I think this whole thing has robbed quite a few people of the ability to enjoy The Evil Within on its own terms, especially in the ways that it favorably resembles games that many people already enjoy. So today, in honor of the 10th anniversary of The Evil Within, I invite doubters, haters, and newcomers alike to hear me out as I address 3 of the most common criticisms of The Evil Within, and how I think it overcomes even its most pressing flaws by being pretty special otherwise. So first, we'll determine how well it actually embodies survival horror, whether that's actually an important goal, and whether it's worthy of Mikami's legacy. Then, we'll address frustrations with its gameplay design, and finally, we'll tackle whether it's actually a good mystery story or just a confusing mess with bland characters. Now don't worry, this isn't a fanboy takedown of any and all comers. There are several things to this day that bug me about The Evil Within, and we'll definitely talk about them, but I'd insist that these can and should be endured so that you can experience one of the weirdest, wildest, and most entertaining survival or action horror games that's ever been made. I hope you'll find something great here that'll help you change your mind if you've maybe given it a try and bounced off of it, or if you've held off entirely because of the bad things that you've heard. So without further ado, welcome to my passionate and hopefully fair defense of one of my all-time favorite games. Let's get stuck in with The Evil Within. The Evil Within has a special, intangible quality about it. Not many experiences let you glory in Hammer horror-esque medieval castles and torture dungeons coated in a film grain, grindhouse aesthetic like you'd see in Mikami's favorite movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or even The Evil Dead, with notes of artist Takumi Nakamura's favorite movie Hellraiser, the industrial grime of Saw, the lighthouse and asylum imagery of Shutter Island, and the world-bending rules of Inception. Evil Within asks the oh-so-enticing question of, what would it be like if you got hooked up to a Silent Hill version of The Matrix that played like a newer Resident Evil? The Evil Within, that's what. Whoa. That's a lot of influences to be juggling at once, but The Evil Within really only struggles when it's abandoned the richness of these influences, opting in later sections for generic cityscapes filled with gunmen who feel like purge rejects instead of harrowing monsters. Now we'll get into that more later, but that's not really the reason that I keep coming back to The Evil Within. No matter how many times I play it, I just don't feel like I've grasped it all. There's an elusive quality to its blend of influences that really hasn't been replicated, and it feels like a masterful homage to everything horror has pretty much ever been up to in one compelling, rustic package. One of Mikami's focuses during development was grounding the player in all these realistic environments that draw from all these influences, making sure that players weren't disoriented by the frequent jumps between different memoryscapes that reflect all these different influences. Atmosphere and menace seep out of every ramshackle cabin, every decaying castle wall, and they shimmer in every pool of blood. The film grain, particle effects, depth of field effects, and the incredible lighting make even the most stylized art direction feel incredibly immediate and cinematic and rich with depth and texture. The sunflower field, the barbed wire brain, the valley of the doll heads, the cityscapes and ruins, these are to this day some of the most poignant images I've ever seen while gaming. In Matt McMuscle's recent interview with Jason Bergman of Bethesda, Bergman noted that it took Tango quite a while to arrive at this distinct style. Early in development, Tango's pitches were getting shot down right and left, and included many different ideas like a sci-fi game on the moon that wasn't even horror, as well as a 2-level prototype in the id Tech 5 engine to get Tango familiar with the engine. Bergman continues that the story's STEM system that accounts for all these different memoryscapes
was a very clever solution to the problem of having so many half-finished ideas. When it was first pitched and put into production, The Evil Within was going to take place in 18th century Spain. It was going to be open world, contain side events like fishing. It was going to be a very different game. Then they swung in a totally different direction, and modern-day assets were used. At some point, though, you've got to make a game. So from a production standpoint, you've got all this stuff laying around. What do you do with it? Enter STEM. Suddenly, all that anachronistic stuff makes sense, or at least some semblance of sense. If you're flipping through the mind of a killer, you can go to totally different time periods and locations in the blink of an eye. It was a very clever way to make use of everything they had created.
Now, artifacts that original Spanish setting are characters' names like protagonist Sebastian Castellanos, Dr. Marcelo Jimenez, and Ruben Victoriano.
¿Qué carajo estás haciendo aquí? ¡Lárgate, cabrón!
Sorry to have bothered you.
Spain, which is also the location of Resident Evil 4, was soon changed to the fictional Crimson City, and the character models took on that kind of westernized anime look that the Resident Evil games had come to have, which looks good even to today, especially Sebastian's rugged model with his 1930s drip going on. This east meets west bridge between art style and lore has always been one of Tango's trademarks, and it's such a rich one. The two best examples of this meeting of cultures are its iconic boss monsters, Laura and the Keeper. Now, the Keeper is often seen as being inspired by Silent Hill's Pyramid Head, a hulking, faceless creature dragging his weapons behind him and pursuing you relentlessly. But he also represents that grindhouse, dirty, hostile-style horror that had become popular in the West post-Saw. The spider-like Laura is an inventive take on the classic Yurei, or ghost, which show up in tales like Yotsuya Kaiden, which features a female ghost with long black hair obscuring her face, often meant to signify how Japanese women in mourning wore their hair down during funerals and burial ceremonies. It's this meeting of East versus West, of schlocky, exploitative grindhouse horror combining with the more ethereal, haunting imagery of Japan into this muscular, compelling force that arrests the player. And as someone who started really loving sci-fi, horror, and superhero movies right around the early 2000s and my late teens, when they were getting really popular, The Evil Within is just a glorious send-up of all the campy excess and technical prowess that artists were really into back then, as they realized the potential of the toys that they had to play with. Oh, and you know that weird, oversaturated, jittery transition thing that almost all 2000s horror movies seem to use? Well, get your fill here, baby, because it's back in The Evil Within. In fact, I'm amazed that people like In Praise of Shadows took issue with this aesthetic. He even called the 2013 live-action trailer cinematography outdated, as if it had been made to look like the late 90s and early 2000s.
It was also made in an extremely dated filmmaking style. The way this is shot and edited, and the way that the sound is mixed into it, all screams late 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, no shit, dude, that's the point.
It is generally seen as a gimmick and is typically avoided because it has always felt a bit cheap, because this was the entirely wrong and dated way to go about this.
Yeah, well, that's just like, your opinion, man.
How someone who regularly reviews old horror movies could miss the point of why this homage is fun is beyond me, but I'm sure you guys know him from the Wendigoon debacle, so no surprise there. Welcome to Thunderdome, YouTube. I've unfortunately been here since I found his half-baked Alan Wake take.
Anyway.
But while it's obvious that The Evil Within's having fun with classic horror tropes, it's not just made for edgy 17-year-olds. It has a sense of lyricism to its excess, and an appreciation for the classics too, like box string arrangement underscoring the brutal violence of a monster hacking someone to bits, or the Pavlovian relief that you feel whenever an Alice in Wonderland-esque mirror cracks nearby and a Bubsy's Clair de Lune plays to signify that a save room is near. This is yet another rich intersection between Western and Asian cultures.
I knew it.
Aside from its musical and cinematic influences, though, Mikami was very upfront about The Evil Within copiously copying Resident Evil 4, even laughing as he said,
"Apologies to Capcom,"
when demurring about which game he was parodying. For instance, both games have DLCs starring double agents in high heels with the word assignment in the title, and both have a tram ride where you can one-shot dynamite-throwing zombies or hold out in a cabin while zombies invade. Now, there are countless other more intentional similarities too, and I'd refer you to Hidden Machine's video on the topic to see most of the fun callbacks. It does make sense, though, that Mikami would go this route, though, this honorific take not just on the legacy of horror, but on his most well-received game. John Johannes actually stepped in to direct the Evil Within DLCs and its sequel, as Mikami stepped back into a producer role. So the Evil Within was his last hurrah, and it's likely a somewhat sentimental one, where he references a lot of his old games like the first zombie encounter in RE1. Now, more cynical minds might assume that Mikami didn't quite know where to go design-wise in this modern landscape, so he just iterated on his old stuff and ripped off his competition at the time. That framing is somewhat true, as we'll learn later on, but it ignores the clear and present quality on display otherwise. That said, there were some big reasons why people would start to build the Evil Within they dreamed of in their head before they actually played the game, and then hold the actual game to the standard thereafter, fair or otherwise. I've heard from numerous folks like the Spear Hunter and In Praise of Shadows that the game's hype cycle was pretty intense and it was hard to get away from even if you were trying to. As far back as 2013, The Evil Within got a live-action trailer whose description read, "Shinji Mikami, the father of survival horror, is back to direct The Evil Within, a game embodying the meaning of pure survival horror." Then the 2014 launch day trailer repeated this pitch and included some hype-filled quotations like Game Informer saying that this is the Resident Evil 4 style follow-up we've been waiting for, and CVG calling it a welcome return to survival horror. Expectations were sky high because of Mikami's reputation, RE4 status, and the invoking of the term survival horror. All of these were thrown into a witch's brew of desire, as the Evil Within needed to somehow be worthy of Mikami's incredible name, live up to the almost impossible to reach legacy of RE4, but also satisfy the more classically minded survival horror rigors of RE1 through 3. No pressure, right? Well, ironically, Mikami accomplished many of these things according to his own standards that had defined the survival horror genre up to this point, but many were unsatisfied. So let's see what led up to the Evil Within's creation, and why there seems to be a disconnect between Mikami and the Evil Within's audience. Interestingly, horror or survival horror had not been a part of the pitch process for the Evil Within until the idea well ran dry. and then Bethesda management stepped in. Jason Bergman revealed that
there absolutely was pressure for Mikami to create a Resident Evil competitor for a variety of reasons, as you can imagine. First, because he's the father of the survival horror genre, so obviously that's what management wanted from him. But also you have to remember that at that time Capcom was moving away from survival horror with their RE games, especially with RE6. It was believed there was a market opportunity for a return to form for the genre.
So while it wasn't his first choice, Bergman notes that Mikami was a perfectionist and would see to it that the game reflected what he thought was the best rendition of the idea they'd all agreed upon. Bergman also noted that while Mikami's a perfectionist, he doesn't often know what he wants until he sees it. Mikami confirmed that this was the case, saying that
there is no formula. I just have to feel it. The important thing in survival horror is providing players the right amount of stress, but also providing a sense of achievement, which is found by defeating creatures and overcoming stress and fear.
I'd argue that its feel is the Evil Within's strongest component, and it's what elevates it above petty battles over whether it is survival horror, action horror, or whatever. Not only does it have impeccable atmosphere, but the feeling of almost always being at a disadvantage and that all the firepower in the world may not be enough is a pretty important one, especially for someone who's trying to figure out where this fits in terms of genre. Despite people deriding its set-piece structure and more moderate atmosphere as ruining the franchise, Resident Evil 4 had a lot of this quality too, what with its opening village scene, the cabin holdout with Luis, the Verdugo boss fight, the Regenerators, or the Double Garrador fight. The Evil Within has way more of this feeling, and it's only to its benefit. In fact, Mikami told resident internet asshole Adam Sessler,
an unstable mind,
that
with this game, we're trying to return to the roots of survival horror. Instead of questioning everything, we seek to rediscover what has always appealed to players of the genre. Let them say to themselves, yes, this is how horror used to be. This is the kind of game I missed. Instead of trying to blaze a new trail with The Evil Within, we're going for a classic, almost nostalgic brand of horror.
Now, understandably, these words are probably like water in the desert to survival horror fans who may have been burnt or perhaps less satisfied by the action focuses of RE5 and 6 and Dead Space. But Mikami's definition of survival horror is much more basic than you often hear in modern discourse. Mikami said in his Archipel feature that
horror is based on fear. It's a tension that is pushed to the maximum. When you escape, you feel relief. It's a roller coaster for the mind. Anything that fits this is horror to me.
He elaborated on this definition to IGN.
The player has to be scared, and that's usually from some monster showing up and the rush that accompanies blowing it away. A good balance of those two things is what makes survival horror.
Now, many modern genre purists would probably decry this as way too vague of a definition or putting us squarely in the vein of action horror. Gasp. And you know what, they're not entirely wrong. Genre definitions do matter. They give someone an accurate representation of what to expect when we use that term to describe something to them. But The Evil Within doesn't fall that neatly into any strict action or survival horror definition or template, and that may be why it's so divisive. It seems like people were needing it to toe party lines and be one of these two things, instead of reaching across the aisle as The Evil Within seems to do. I'd argue that's what makes The Evil Within special, though, that it manages to provide tons of tension that ebbs and flows, as much as your strategy from stealth to being found out to combat to running away might. It's never truly a power fantasy or an outright action game, but neither is it some, thief-adjacent experience either, and it often captures the spirit or the joy of old survival horror in conveniently modern ways. So let's take a gander at the first gameplay sequence to kind of get an idea of where people's heads are at when they criticize what The Evil Within is and what it's trying to be. And we'll unfortunately realize that some people just seem to have forgotten how to play video games for just The Evil Within, as it's doing nothing out of the ordinary and actually emulates most every other game out there, including very well-regarded games like Red Dead Redemption 2 and The Last of Us. I think this breakdown in the basic reading of how video games communicate importance to the player reeks of entitlement and just flat-out laziness, if I'm being honest. Reading is fundamental, after all.
Reading is fundamental.
So, let's check it out. After Sebastian is knocked out in the opening sequence, he wakes up in an abattoir of death. The masked sicko known as the Sadist loudly hacking up body parts in the next room. Seb frees himself with a knife as Air on a G-string by Bach plays over the gramophone. which is very demure, and then we are told to crouch so that we aren't heard or seen. The sadist moves away from his chopping block into the back of the space. The player likely assumes that they're to follow him, or at least enter the room that he's leaving, and we do, coming upon a button prompt to pick up the keys that are dangling right over the chopping block. Now I've seen numerous players say that they bypassed this entirely and went straight for the bad guy. They then see a stealth kill prompt pop up when they get behind the sadist, but the attack weirdly doesn't kill the sadist because he's too tough, and he auto-kills the player. Now I'll be honest, it was easier to miss what you're supposed to do here than I first remembered, so I'll give you that. But if stabbing the guy doesn't work, you try something else, right? Well, apparently not. Far too many people have said that this is bad design because why are they given the option to stealth kill if it doesn't do anything? But they've ignored two big clues about what you're supposed to do instead. One, the keys that you're supposed to pick up are right in front of you, and you have to pass by them to even get near the sadist to make the stealth kill prompt pop up in the first place, which is actually much harder to do than just pausing briefly to check out the scene. As we crouch walk slowly and he walks pretty fast, so we have to go out of our way to follow him directly to make that happen. Worse still, if you die in this section and reload, the keys actually start glowing bright blue and can be seen from afar, loudly proclaiming that they are your objective, not killing the sadist. But even if you miss this on the first go, which is fair enough, no harm no foul, reload and try the glowing keys, right? But players clearly bypass this easy problem-solving method and the game's own clue system and then blame the game for pushing them around. Now how do I know this? Because they went to the forums. If they just solved the problem quickly, like a 1-2 punch, oh that didn't work, let me try this new thing that the game's already accounted for, they could just be past it and wouldn't have to take to the internet to complain about it. Guys, I'm the one that's usually nitpicking this kind of stuff. Don't make me be the get good guy instead here. But I guess desperate times call for desperate measures. Now, another criticism this opening sequence gets is how linear it is, which is a weird one to me. They complain that it's so slow and linear and then you get hurt and you have to waddle around some, and yet it's maybe 5 minutes to set the mood, play some sections that tutorialize stealth, which is by definition a slower gameplay style, and that gets you into the cat and mouse game of how the next couple chapters will play, and then it'll launch you into the game proper. You know, like an introduction pretty much always is done in modern games. Have you played perhaps Red Dead Redemption 2's opening? The walk slowly through the snow simulator? The slow to a crawl every time we hit a camp and have to talk to people to advance the story simulator? You don't really hear people complain about that nearly as much, do you? So where's the same energy? Now, I don't personally love Red Dead Redemption 2 for how slow it is, but I'd never argue that this ruined my ability to enjoy the rest of the game. That's not the only example. Let's take a look at another classic in The Last of Us, which is often said to have one of the greatest openings of all time. Now, of course, if you're not familiar, this opening shows the beginning of everyday guy Joel's life turning topsy-turvy when a zombie outbreak happens and his daughter gets killed by accident by a soldier trying to contain the outbreak. It's mostly cinematics, but when it does tell the player to do something, we're mostly just moving inside of a guided cutscene, and if we diverge at all from the path, we get gunned down instantly and fail. So it's hyperlinear, there's no player expression, but we're setting the stage. Hence the tight direction. So we've got two different intros to two different quote-unquote great games, right? But you don't hear any fans of those games telling you that, oh god, I loved everything but that. They just sort of suck it up and move along, right? Countless other modern titles do this too, so The Evil Within had no reason to be catching strays like this for something that no one really complained about anywhere else. This goofy response to the game's opening is a microcosm of bigger things, to quote Rick Glassman's relative.
I think it's a microcosm of more serious things, but, you know.
Time and again, players seem to call The Evil Within outdated for copying things from RE's 4, 5, and 6, and maybe even Dead Space and Last of Us, and yet act like they also don't know how these prevalent design conventions work or why they're being used, even when they're not being confusingly presented to the player. It's a bit befuddling. But let's take a break from smashing the haters with facts and logic, as the Zoomers say, and get into why mechanics like the stealth system and the intro were quite a departure for survival horror adjacent games, but also surprisingly well adapted to the spirit of the genre. Stealth was a new wrinkle for Mikami's toolkit. Mikami said in a PlayStation Access interview that his games allow players to defeat enemies, and that's simply because it's more entertaining, and that running and hiding for hours would get old. Many of the best moments in The Evil Within start with a disempowering, cautious approach that invites careful study of the level design and enemy configurations, and then gives them satisfying agency to vacillate between sneaking, stealth kills, and direct confrontation if they so choose. In fact, when I was replaying the original Resident Evil 4 for this video's context, I kept finding myself really missing the ability to first sneak up and try to pick off some guys to even the playing field. The Evil Within adds depth to the cat and mouse nature of classic survival horror, and it's all the better for it. The RE4 remake even added stealth takedowns as a completely viable strategy too, likely in response to the Evil Within's own innovations. And while some survival horror purists may find it heretical to have actual sneaking mechanics accounting for the evasive save ammo style gameplay that is common for that genre, this rigid definition of survival horror ignores that the stealth system still has friction and moments of brutal failure and exhilarating reward, which is exactly why they like the genre in the first place. I'd argue that stealth as a strategic starting point is just as much in the spirit of survival horror conservationism as standing bolt upright and slowly trying to squeeze past enemies through narrow corridors. Stealth encounters are often set up predictably with a lot of cover or lanes to scoot between and determine whether you want to distract enemies, evade them entirely, or try to sneak up for some stealth kills. You crouch much like you do in The Last of Us down to the animation, though notably you can't take active cover, you can just lean behind stuff, which makes stealth feel somewhat loose and unrefined in higher difficulties when enemies will react to even the tip of your nose hanging out of cover. I've noticed that enemy AI is a really obnoxious response to throwing bottles as distractions, another Last of Us staple. They'll look all around when they hear the bottle crash, not just in the direction of the crash like most games, so you have to wait at least 2 or 3 seconds before their alarm animation turns into a patrol, away from you and towards where you threw it, before you can actually come out of hiding. Now, one fun thing to note about these bottles, though, is that because the Evil Within is set in a dreamscape made up of the memories of everyone hooked up to it, these empty bottles could very likely be meant to symbolize all the booze that Sebastian has drunk over the years as he descended into alcoholism because of the loss of his wife and child. This would be a really cool micro detail if it was intentional, but regardless, the bottle mechanic generally works very well otherwise, and enemies are predictable in their reactions, a quality that I can't see that the Evil Within 2 has, which we'll get to in a later video. The AI can be a little unfair in the Evil Within, but it being smarter than the average bear actually helps the player in stealth sequences because they react to stimuli much more directly, instead of just losing track of what just happened really quickly like they do in the Evil Within 2. You can stay hidden as long as you want, but you can always escalate the situation, especially if you realize that getting around the last couple enemies might just be easier if you just blew them away really quickly. But you're still having to consider whether or not you can possibly outmaneuver enemies that have a Dark Souls level of ability to mess you up even if they're grunts. Is the rush of combat worth it even if you can afford to expend all this ammo? You may just end up making subsequent encounters like boss fights way harder than they would have been otherwise if you'd just been patient and conserved your ammo, and kept your interactions with the world at a much lower strain on your resources, meaning you participate in sneaking, stealth kills, or leading into the game's most innovative mechanics, traps, and the matchstick fire system. In pre-release press, Mikami often highlights traps as being one of the central gameplay hooks. The explosive and bear traps return almost verbatim from Resident Evil 4, but they're remixed to resemble those in BioShock, where you can sneak up to them and hack them for parts. You can also just aggro enemies and get them to follow you into tripwires if you wish to kill them without expending your own resources. Balancing your ammo, the traps in the environment, and even one-off items like the hand axes lets you have some survival horror say-so, how enemies are downed, and to what cost your future success that they come at. A common criticism is that there are too many traps that are impossible on a first run to see, and these lead to many cheap deaths or just exorbitant amounts of damage. These situations don't come up a ton, but they are prevalent enough to be frustrating when paired with the one-hit kill bosses that come up from time to time, or at least so many players have reported. Mikami has said that the Evil Within was supposed to be a hard game, so some sections are designed to convince you of how unforgiving and unpredictable this world is. But there are a couple times where you're going to be rightly going, dude, another trap that I couldn't have foreseen that I ran into while trying to get away from a mob? Screw you. And you know what? I'm right there with you. The other new variable that Tango implemented was the match and fire system, and how it works is that any enemy once down can be lit on fire with the match, and so can certain assets like hay bales, which can be a devastating attack if you've got a group following you and they're close to that hay bale when you light it on fire. You can often make enemies fall by shooting their legs and then finish them off with a well-timed match while they're down. You can also try for the highest IQ play and try to knock down enemies near upright enemies so that when you light up the downed enemy, the ones walking over them light up as well. When it works, it's one of the most satisfying things you'll ever do in a video game, but part of the reason why the Evil Within can be a real pain in the butt is that the precision required to pull this off is really player unfriendly sometimes. Even when downed, many enemies can still flail around and hit you, knocking you out of this match dropping animation. This match drop animation can also take so long to complete that you can line up what feels like a perfect trap, and if they didn't outright interrupt the animation, a lot of times you'll be a hair too late and watch as the enemy walks over the burning enemy without catching fire because you didn't hit that perfect timing window. The match system's artificial balancing is just too arbitrary here, and too finicky to pull off and way too slow and easy to interrupt. Despite allowing for some really satisfying risk-reward gameplay, The Evil Within can err far too much on the side of risk and feel like it's loaded the dice against you in an uninteresting and unfun way. People have also said the same of the stamina meter and ammo restrictions, but I don't agree here, at least nearly as much. Sebastian's meager starting stamina lets him run about 3 seconds according to nearly everyone's math. I don't know why, but that's just what everybody makes sure that you know that they've realized for some reason. It's only 3 seconds. So anyway, if you sprint until the meter is gone, Sebastian will start wheezing and gasping like an adult onset asthmatic. And you know what? I get it. It does start out pretty limited, but there are several key justifications for this choice that people are missing the point of. The sprint is short, but it's not unusable early on. It just needs to be conserved and kind of used in short bursts. And notably, he only stops and wheezes if you exhaust the meter. If you pull up just short and stop sprinting right before the meter expires, you'll be good. Also, like so many aspects of Sebastian, the sprint can be upgraded with the green gel that you pick up off dead enemies in the environment, and you can eventually offset the disadvantages of this sprint.
There now, you see? All better.
Sebastian can also upgrade his life bar, melee damage, and how much health syringes heal him, in addition to every weapon having its own stat bumps for accuracy, damage, both normal and critical, reload time, and ammo capacity. Now, that sentence alone may be enough to persuade old heads that The Evil Within is too obsessed with modern trends where action-centric games like Borderlands or Far Cry 3 had upgrade paths that supplemented their otherwise fairly standard first-person shooter gameplay. It's also been said that the ability to spec out of bad situations goes against the survival horror grain, or that it's a pointless surface-level system. And while 2020 era's games have certainly over-implemented completely vapid skill trees in just about every genre, I disagree that this is the case here. So the 3 most important upgrade paths in The Evil Within are accuracy, critical damage, and sprint duration. Sprinting for longer is invaluable because you can create virtual advantage for yourself by simply not taking damage, and that essentially makes the rest of your kit even better by proxy. The second most important upgrade is accuracy, because the default aim sensitivity is really too wobbly by design, and the console auto-aim overcorrects and bends bullets wanted style so that it makes you miss when you actually line up a good shot, so you thought. The aiming camera zooms in far too much to just show you Sebastian's arm and gun, and this obscures the sides of the screen and makes it easy for the, frankly, too unpredictable animations of enemies to be even harder to adjust to, as they loll their heads randomly or lunge at your left shoulder so that you miss high and right as you shoot. To offset these frustrations, you'll want to invest in critical damage, which means you go from killing even the most basic zombies in 2 to 3 headshots like you would in RE4 to usually just 1 or 2. If enemies are dead quicker, they can't make you waste any more health hypos or drain any more ammo or matches, and you may not have to upgrade other parts of your Sebastian character if you're dealing so much damage that it invalidates the enemy's ability to kill you. And let's be honest, few games have more satisfying critical damage headshots than The Evil Within. There's a lack of feedback on certain enemies when you're just shotgunning them, but boy howdy, if you catch a grunt enemy in the head just right with a pistol, it feels like blowing up a gore-filled pinata. The damage feedback and the effects are so gooey, gross, and glorious. So now that we're talking gunplay feedback, let's take a moment to gush over how fun Sebastian's arsenal is. I really enjoy all the weapons here, and partly because they feel so rustic and classic. They're essentially all World War I and earlier type weapons, and it makes The Evil Within feel like you're Van Helsing and Dracula or something. Sebastian's starting weapon is a classic 6-shooter revolver that you can of course upgrade to have a larger capacity. This doesn't make any real-world sense, and it's not like it gets more chambers to put rounds in, but this is a dream revolver, so don't get weird about it, nerd. I actually greatly prefer the revolver sound from the earlier builds of the game, but I can't argue with how good the headshots feel with this gun once you've upgraded that stat, or how satisfying and RE4-like it is to shoot enemies in the leg and burn them at the match when they fall to the ground. The other pistol you get is a Magnum that absolutely tears ass like how RE4 fans would appreciate. And in keeping with the old school feel of the weapons, we're blessed with a classic Springfield bolt-action sniper rifle, which has a nice dose of auto-aim to it, like a lot in certain cases. And some absolutely killer feedback, as it staggers enemies and has a unique headshot impact. This thing will change your life against many of the bosses and tandems really well with sprint upgrades once you've gotten a good distance from an enemy. Don't sleep on this gun and enjoy it while it lasts, because the sniper rifle in Evil Within 2 gets almost no ammo. You have to craft almost all of it, and you barely get to make any bullets. And it's also got way worse hit detection. And while these other guns are fun, the real stars of the show in The Evil Within are the shotguns and the Agony Crossbow, the game's most unique weapon. And yes, I said shotguns. If you were cool like me and pre-ordered The Evil Within, you'd unlock a double-barreled shotgun that would become available in Chapter 2, which really helps you mess up the Chainsaw Sadist boss. It's almost as good as any other double-barreled I've ever seen in that it fires fast and hits crazy hard. The only balance to it is that it can't be upgraded, so it basically supercharges your early chapters beyond what other players would experience, and then falls off as the game progresses in favor of the upgradable classic pump shotgun. I must say though, I never even knew the shotgun existed in my inventory until my recent replay. I got quite a kick out of finding out that it existed. So did my enemies. But let's not let this novelty item steal the show from the king of kings, the classic pump shotgun that you'd think cops would be taking out mafiosos with on the streets of New York. This shotgun is great, and it's one of the few guns that really feels like it's just threshing enemies, especially the fat ones when you upgrade the crit damage and start knocking their heads off. Shotguns have long been the workhorse weapon of action-oriented survival horror, and it's no different here. The shotgun's kickback knocking enemies to the ground for follow-up match kills is also a real thing that you should plan around and take full advantage of, and it makes the different mechanics really feel like they're working together to make you feel capable and strategically intelligent. Okay. So those are the classic weapons. Now let's get to the weird one in the Agony Crossbow. The Agony Crossbow is more like a multi-use grenade launcher in that it has a bit of a charge time and has to be aimed carefully to account for the physics of its bullet drop. Now while it can do devastating damage, it's really more of an all-purpose setup weapon that increases the potency of the rest of your kit. The Agony Crossbow has 5 different bolt types, 7 if you're like me and always play with the 2 extra poison and incendiary bolts from the Fighting Chance DLC pre-order bonus pack. Honestly, I'm kind of pissed on other people's behalf that these 2 extra bolt types and the double-barreled shotgun were never made available as separate DLC to purchase for the average consumer. Such a waste. But anyway, these bolt types include flash bolts, which blind enemies so that you can either get space from them or sneak up behind them for a stealth kill while they're blinded. A generic damage variant on the harpoon bolt, a shock bolt that stuns enemies and often drops them to their knees, a freeze bolt which makes them susceptible to a follow-up one-hit kill, a poison bolt which does gradual damage once stuck into an enemy, and then the glorious incendiary bolt which looks like you're shooting a nitrous-boosted car engine full of shooting flames into bad guys. Incapacitating enemies with flash or freeze bolts, or the explosive bolts to trigger other flammable objects and traps in the world, is a really fun balance to achieve, and some of the most skillful play comes from trying to set up situations in which domino effects happen based on the status effects that the crossbow adds to the battlefield. There are also 3 other special weapons that you can get for doing in-game actions like Brass Knuckles if you beat the game on a Kumu or Nightmare, and the Burstfire Handgun and High-Powered Sniper Rifle for finding the collectibles. But I've never done the requirements for these, so I can't report on their goodness, so here's somebody else enjoying them. I can note too that the 2 weapons that you unlock for beating the game, the machine gun and the rocket launcher, are quite effective but unfortunately have finite ammo reserves across all your saves, meaning that you'll often use up the 200 starting rounds on your machine gun pretty early on and only find maybe 90 more rounds the rest of the game. The rocket launcher only has 30 rounds in it, and once they're gone, you're done for the rest of the new game pluses you engage in that save file thereafter.
I better hold on to this.
But if all this talk of satisfying weaponry seems totally antithetical to survival horror, I get your pearl clutching. There is something to be said for this not being your daddy's survival horror, if it is indeed survival horror enough to wear the name. You know, balance the game around wimpy guns and meager resources and let me deal with increasing AI difficulty like a real survival horror fan, you might say. Not have me make up the difference with incremental, out-of-genre stat increases in powerful guns. Now, I hear that, but it's essentially the same effect either way. Let's not pretend that the nerds haven't told us that Silent Hill 2's janky combat is actually more immersive because it sucks, because that's what it's like to fight while mentally ill, which is a very politically incorrect assessment. But it's also just BS headcanon to justify how the developers made it easier to tune for their side of things, while turning the game's most simple actions into Herculean efforts that would be easier to do in real life. What's more, even fully upgraded, Sebastian never feels like an action hero per se, just more capable than he did before. For instance, Dead Space is also very tense, but you're generally blowing the living hell out of everything or you're dead. RE4 is quite similar in that way, although of course it has its moments where you're disempowered. And RE6 too, where you feel like you're the star of the show, like you're on the front foot, right? You're gonna feel good from time to time in The Evil Within, you know, like you've got the power. But every rush of excitement is always tempered by the fact that you've likely just expended most of your resources for a badass moment, and now have 2 or 3 bullets in most of your guns and maybe a grenade left. So sure hope you can handle whatever comes next. The real joy of combat is realizing its subtle depth, and that it actually captures the spirit of survival horror better than really any game of its era, and certainly more than the industry had seen for years at this point. Spear Hunter in particular noted that the one egregious thing the Evil Within does is cap your ammo limitations early on unless you upgrade them, saying the average survival horror game would reward you for finding ways to conserve ammo early on and let you splurge on damage later as needed for boss fights and such.
Multiple times in the early game, you will have to pass up ammo lying around because you can't pick it up. The game doesn't have an actual inventory system like Resident Evil, where you can bank piles of ammo and items. Games like classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill let you carry whatever amount of a specific ammo type you can find. The balance in those titles came in the amount of damage enemies took. So if you had like 50 to 100 pistol bullets saved up, all of that could end up being spent on just a few basic enemies, encouraging you to get around them and run away. The way this game handles the player not having a ton of ammo is that a lot of the time you're forced into combat situations where defeated enemies will drop ammo. This game's take on ammo distribution and conservation feels so artificial.
Now, point taken, and I'd agree that's a fun, rewarding design choice that makes the player honest and rewards them for being smart and skillful to achieve such a game state. But the nuance in the Evil Within is that you're never actually all that flush with ammo, and rarely does the gameplay oversupply outside of the occasional 3 to 5 extra pistol bullets that you might not be able to pick up because your pockets haven't been upgraded to, account for those extra bullets. Now, being frustrated that you're not able to stockpile is weird if you're still going into most encounters with the same amount of ammo regardless as you would in any other survival horror game. The difference between a nitpick and a real complaint is the actual impact of the perceived flaw. If it doesn't change the game much and you end up playing the game just like a survival horror situation anyway, the net effect is still what you supposedly wanted. Now let's be honest, I know survival horror diehards will tell people Silent Hill 2 and friends need to play like dog shit because it's part of the story or something, but don't change your tune now as soon as the game just does something in a little bit more of a roundabout way that has the same net effect. Rick and Morty said it best.
Your booze mean nothing. I've seen what makes you cheer.
The Evil Within is still at its best with these built-in restrictions, and especially on the survival difficulty. The exacting nature of the controls and the fact that you've never really got enough resources to just cut loose means it's to your benefit to play in a measured way, and it's also just more interesting. Spear Hunter also said that the game plays like a good action game when you play on New Game Plus with all of your upgrades and weapons.
When you finish the story and start New Game Plus with all of your upgraded gear, the title is way more fun to play in my opinion. Blasting your way through all of the weirdo levels early on feels way more natural to me than trying to jankily sneak around.
But I don't think this is true either. You can smoke a boss or two that you wouldn't have otherwise, and that's fun. But it's never as satisfying or dramatic a revenge tale as you'd think. And while there's plenty of good feedback, it's just not consistently explosive enough to stand on its own as an action game. It needs the tension of low resources and damage input to be more interesting more often than not. If anything, playing in a more overpowered way accentuates what the game isn't nearly as good at, which is reflex-intensive action, and which is actually what people would want to avoid if they accepted how the game was built in a classic stealth-to-combat trajectory that reflects a survival horror mindset. But let's be fair and address some concerns that I think are valid with how balanced around disempowerment the Evil Within actually is. Ironically, people say that they wanted more of this disempowerment, but actually recoiled at every attempt that Tango made to satisfy those desires. But I would say that their criticisms are at least based in how weird the game can feel and how it can be balanced at times, so let's entertain those real quick. So widescreen black bars were a common complaint. Artist Ikumi Nakamura still likes them despite fan feedback that they sucked, and Mikami seems especially attached because he likes movies or something. But I think this is a reasonable criticism. Yeah, it looks cool, but it wastes almost a third of the screen in a game with tons of blindside traps and huge epic boss fights where you need spatial awareness above and to the sides of you. You can certainly get used to the black bars, and I always have, but it does wear out its novelty and start to negatively impact gameplay enough that I'm glad that they finally relented in 2015 and added a full screen option, which you can see I took full advantage of on my footage and really enjoyed because you really don't want to miss out on all the great looking environments. Another totally valid frustration, and one that I've always had, is that the controls have a looseness to them that can be really frustrating. The melee combat's also terrible. RE4 let you take down hordes with your infinite use knife if you timed it just right, but you can only use your knife in the Evil Within for stealth kills. Not a bad balancing act, but it just means that otherwise, Sebastian swings so hard and wide with his fists that he's off balance and often leaves himself open to counterattacks. Melee also does almost no damage, even fully upgraded, so it has no real positive strategic effect and really should have just been better tuned in the player's favor or eradicated as an option altogether. The game's hard enough already without this useless feature. The controls are just frustrating enough when you push them to their limits that I don't play on Nightmare, for instance, which already ups the enemy count and makes it even more likely that some annoying small base thing will get you killed. The traps you never see coming contribute to a sense of abusive gameplay design too. It's just not very fun, so I empathize with people here at a baseline level. But let's be real about the game's limitations. Sometimes they can be frustrating, but that isn't the whole or the majority of what it feels like to play this game. And if you're feeling that way, it's likely that you're not engaging the vantage point of power that the game is putting you at and realizing A, what your limitations are, but also what your strengths are at this level as well. And let's be honest, a lot of the people that would enjoy this game and come to it in the first place have already endured their fair share of wonkiness from other classics just fine with no complaints. Despite being lauded as one of the greatest games ever, RE4's camera has never been great, right? That kind of herky-jerky shoulder thing where you're kind of tugging him to try and go left to right. Every time I've played that game, it's taken me at least an hour to get used to those controls. And actually, it's the first reason why I bounced off that game and almost never finished it. If you'll recall, sometimes you hold down the aim button and you're facing the totally wrong way once Leon sights in. Point being, RE4 is a great game, and I think it'll stand at the test of time no problem. Kinda wish they'd just done a little bit more to make it slightly less irritating to control. Likewise, The Last of Us, which Tango likely took notes from, plays very similarly in terms of its base stealth and confrontation balance, and even has some of the most literally hit or miss combat with those one-hit kill clickers. You know, you fought off a big wave with your gun, but there's just one that's come to you in your blind spot and will get you if you weren't facing exactly the right way to rebuff them. Sounds like The Evil Within a little bit, doesn't it? But you don't hear anybody bitching about these in The Last of Us, and these are way more likely to happen in The Last of Us because clicker waves are, a dime a dozen. And I don't want to derail this conversation too much on phantom menaces that I concocted for this argument, but where is the same energy when The Last of Us plays very loosely and difficult without giving you the greatest means to turn the tide? Is that world-class friction, or is that some avoidable jank on the part of the developers, but endurable jank on the part of the audience member? Just remember, the answer has to be consistent between both games, not merely glossed over because you think The Last of Us has a great story and The Evil Within doesn't, or, the rest of the game is so much better, therefore why would I care, or something along those lines. The funny thing is that survival horror purists will defend all day the spotty hit detection and stilted animations of their classic favorite games, and act like, well, it's not really the point anyway, there's more going on here, and then crucify The Evil Within for doing the same thing, but not extending the same grace to the rest of its features. Now, they're picking on something that could be improved, sure, but when you're complaining about the risk-reward economy in The Evil Within that's lauded nearly everywhere else, and then suddenly we lose all allegiance to these sworn principles, I have to say, balderdash.
Your boos mean nothing. I've seen what makes you cheer.
Now, as for the one-hit kill monsters or traps that you often hear people complain about, these frustrations are occasionally valid, but often overblown, I've found. Let's start with the most valid complaints, that the game fails to broadcast when certain bosses are unkillable in very specific scripted scenes, and we'll also tackle the infamous Ruvik chase scenes in the mansion. So I've just replayed the game twice more recently, and found only 2 instances of this confusing, unkillable boss phenomenon, both involving Laura, the spider lady. The first time is that fantastically terrifying appearance from inside the blood puddle. Understandably, you'd want to put her down immediately, but you're actually meant to run back down the hall because she's only susceptible to fire damage, as you find out later. Now, if you don't run, you'll die immediately. But just like the sadist stealth kill in the intro not working, you'd think that maybe people would assume that running away was something worth trying if they keep dying in this room and aren't quite sure what to do, or their weapons aren't killing her. Well, yes and no. What makes it hard to judge if people are just being impatient and obstinate as they have been elsewhere is how inconsistently the scripted clue as to what to do here actually triggers. So when Laura rises from the puddle, Sebastian will wait a beat and then say, "Shit, I'd better run." But sometimes he'll say it within 10 seconds or so, which would give you enough time to know, okay, I need to book it. But then other times, like my footage here, he won't say it until I've slowly limped all the way down to the end of the hall.
Shit, I'd better run.
So it's totally possible that the game's not giving certain people the clue at the right time and is messing up their ability to understand what they're being told to do. but your mileage will probably vary for this as it did for me. The second time Laura pursues us and she can't be killed, it's actually far more clear what we're supposed to do. This is really something that players should not be complaining about. Laura pops into our space here after we flipped a switch to a door that starts to open very slowly, indicating that we need to hold out until it raises just enough so we can go under it and get away. So we've got one very obvious example of what to do, and a second where the obvious instruction to run is given, albeit sometimes delivered a little late. So I don't really think that this is something that needs to be complained about nearly as much as I see it. Another brain fart I'd like to address is the supposed unfairness of invisible enemies. Across a 15 to 17 hour campaign, you'll see these guys maybe 3 times, so the propensity for them to be worth mentioning in public forum posts is low. Lower still when you realize upon inspection that these are not actually unfair in any real way, but they're actually ingeniously designed. Unlike RE4's invisible enemies, you can't see the Evil Within's invisible guys' outline at all, and the only thing that makes them visible is dealing damage to them, which sometimes means that you'll be firing a bit blindly hoping to wing them so that they'll reveal themselves and you can finish them off. But Tango doesn't leave you hanging, just hoping and praying that you hit something, as every area that these invisible guys are in is very intentionally filled with overturned furniture and puddles, so that these guys are often leaving tracks or knocking things over as they approach you. They're quite scary and they don't hit much harder than any other enemy, so not only are these some of the tensest encounters outside of bosses, but they're interesting and well balanced and certainly not too difficult as a lot of people have called them. This is a total L on the part of the people dogging these guys. But let's give the haters a bone and tackle one of their most valid concerns, and that is the Ruvik chase scenes in the mansion level. Ruvik, the game's main villain, will show up like a slower moving nemesis from the RE games, and he'll stalk you at 3 points in the mansion, and you must either simply outrun him or hide from him until a timer expires and he leaves. Now it's not entirely clear when he will spawn particularly, but he does seem to be on a timer that spawns him once into each of the 3 main puzzle areas here. The timer seems to be sped up based on whether you actually completed the puzzle, but that's not always when he appears. Other times he'll just show up in really strange, abrupt ways while you're caught up in another fight or just out in the open somewhere, and he'll get you killed without even knowing what was happening. So I feel that. At first I was really going to go after people for this section because I never remember having trouble with it and couldn't imagine why people kept complaining. It's like just outrun him and you'll be fine, right? But having replayed it again and dying 3 more times in 3 cheap ways, I have to admit there's more frustration here than I remembered or experienced in my earlier playthroughs. So let's check that out. On one playthrough, I had engaged 2 zombies and was getting messed up by them. I was off balance, not having a very good time, and for some reason, this mundane interaction that wasn't near the puzzle or hadn't had a puzzle completed ended up triggering Ruvik. I was off balance already, and for some reason, Ruvik showed up, and I couldn't possibly respond, so I got killed immediately. In another playthrough, which I didn't record, I noticed that if I got too far away from him, i.e. did what I was supposed to, he could teleport into my blind spot ahead of me in the direction I was running to kill me. There's high variance here, and I can totally see how this would turn some people off. I know I started to get really cranky as my preconceived notion of how fair this section was starting to evaporate. Now, this section has been fairly maligned because while it can go off without a hitch and just be a fun stalker set piece like Nemesis or Mr. X in classic Resident Evils, his ability to teleport or show up when you've got no way to defend yourself and kill you immediately is legitimately frustrating. Also factor in how the game doesn't really auto-save through the 10 to 15 minute stretches of each of the 3 wings where he'll show up, and you'll frequently lose a lot of meticulous exploration and stealth that you just work pretty hard for, which is not a defensible design choice either in my opinion. But that's the one example of the frustrating one-hit kills that people are right to dog the Evil Within for. The one-hit kill bosses? Not so much. Now these aren't my favorite design, but they only technically exist in about 8 sections in all the Evil Within's many encounters, and plenty of them are actually defensible. The chainsaw guy can kill you in one hit just like RE4, but it's actually much easier to evade him in the Evil Within because you got a lot more space to run around in. Late game water monsters will get you if you don't distract them properly with dead bodies, but this is kind of a classic floor is lava design, and it's not like it's some brutal challenge, it's, the whole point of the area. Now Laura kills you in one hit in all 3 of her encounters if she gets too close, but only one of them is an actual fight, as the first 2 are merely straight shot escape sequences. The Amalgam Alpha's second form can gobble you up in one hit, which is annoying, and Ruvik's form can when he chases you in the manor. That leaves quite a few encounters like the Giant Twins, the Sentinel Dog, the Heresy Boss, the Quell Boss, and the Traumas that are not based around this being a factor. The last boss kills you in one hit in like one 20-second little section where you have to dodge his hands, but this is also right at a checkpoint, so I wouldn't count this one as being inconvenient enough to complain about, especially since it's not that hard to dodge them. Now, Because of Laura's terrifying visage and her prominence in the story, I think it makes sense for her to be this dangerous, especially since she's not particularly fast, and you have the opportunity to outrun her even more if you're upgrading your sprint. But I do concede that the Ruvik chase scene is a mixed bag, as it can feel like a breeze or real pain depending on how the AI reacts to your movements. The only one-hit kill boss that I think is a bit too much is the Amalgam Alpha boss fight. It charges you and wildly sweeps back and forth in a huge swath, meaning that you're likely to get clipped even if you got well clear of his initial charge. It's just too wide of an attack for Sebastian to avoid. Worse, if you get past this and knock the Amalgam into his second phase, he charges at you very directly and eats you up immediately if you get anywhere near him. On New Game Plus, you can just melt him without too much effort using, the machine gun or the rocket launcher, but on the default playthrough, his design is obnoxious compared to the player's abilities. It felt a lot like trial and error to get through, which is rarely all that interesting. That said, even this frustrating fight can have these incredible moments like this, one of my favorite ever clips that I recorded from my first playthrough back in 2014. Now you see here that I'm on my very last health point, and I get off this last shot to kill the boss right as he's about to land the killing blow. Remember how Mikami said survival horror was about lining up a shot and killing a beast right before it gets you? This is exactly what he's talking about. I get his point viscerally here. Just by the hair of my chinny chin chin. Oh, and while we're on the topic of bosses, let's close the gameplay section analysis by highlighting them and the other excellently designed enemies. Ikumi Nakamura absolutely slays with some of the best monster designs I've ever seen. The basic haunted zombies' eyes glowing white and their expression grimacing as they prepare to attack is such a frightening attention to detail, and one that Mikami said is actually really important for satisfying survival horror combat. But good as the average enemy is, the bosses are even more impressive. Even if they're not mind-bendingly complicated to engage, they all look fantastic. Taking a page from RE4's over-the-top book, and also in keeping with the greatest hits of horror mentality, the Evil Within's bosses span quite the gamut stylistically. The Keeper is a relentless pursuer who can smash you with his hammer, flail you with his flail, or lay traps for you. And even if you kill him, he comes right back by respawning from another safe lying around, distorting the screen as he does so, and making it hard to know which direction to run away in. He's the stuff of nightmares, and his Chapter 7 boss fight is one of the greatest boss fights I've ever played, recalling the glory of old Silent Hill 2 Pyramid Head fights, even up to having to fight two Keepers in the last level. And while Laura's probably the scariest boss, the Keeper is likely the best boss in the whole game from a design perspective, as he tests your ability to manage your stamina, avoid traps, and escape the poison gas in the chamber by turning a crank whenever you've incapacitated him, or waiting for him to respawn after you've killed him. This feeling the Keeper gives you is the same feeling you get whenever the game is at its best. I can't overstate just how exciting and dangerous so many of the encounters feel. Now, many have decried The Evil Within as feeling like a clunky attempt at survival horror with too many action horror set pieces, but that's mostly about 3 or 4 chapters late in the game in the daytime, not the first 2/3 of the game, and it's certainly not the game's main takeaway. The game's always at its best on survival, where the enemy count is fair, every encounter is tense, and you always feel like you've got just enough stuff to win, but really can't afford to waste anything, or the encounters can go pear-shaped really fast. The boss battles are exhilarating with some of the best animation work you're ever going to see. Feels like a glorious evolution of the throw everything at the wall as you face every manner of concept. What the fuck is that sentence? Almost every boss fight feels like you're in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the most skin-crawling freaks imaginable, like a Bloodborne boss fight, these creatures bristling with deformities and viscera. It's the stuff we come to horror for, blown up like an interactable movie poster, and you're given the chance to rid the world of them. It's awesome. Now these moments are so much of why The Evil Within keeps me coming back. The atmosphere and the set pieces are just full of emergent, weird stuff, and they're creatively and vividly realized enough that it's hard not to want to return to this waking nightmare. People just have to realize how good they've got it here, and understand that they'd probably be much more accommodating of this title if it had Resident Evil on the cover, as it often feels just like those games, but with a more high-concept story, a much bigger scope, and far more interesting visuals and psychological horror, and despite being made with top-tier cinematic intelligence. The Evil Within's not a movie that stops every now and again to let us play. The Evil Within's a well-made video game. So, we've determined that the gameplay has its fair share of finickiness, and some of the scripted encounters just play too loosely to be consistently fun. But there's an emergent excitement to this unpredictability that makes getting your timing just right all the more rewarding. Mikami's living up to the definition of survival horror as he's always known it, just expressing it in different ways, but always valuing entertainment and the rush of barely surviving over some strict adherence to the classic definition, one which may be more masochistic than actually enjoyable or interesting. I just question how much lived context that naysayers have. But I have this sort of intuition that people are talking about a time that's more mythic than their lived experience. There hadn't been any old school survival horror games when The Evil Within came out since like 2008. Classic survival horror games had basically either phased out or just stopped being made, and we'd since gotten games like Dead Space in 2008, RE5 and 6, which definitely moved the needle up more to set-piece action. And then by the time The Evil Within came out, it really had no other competition in its type of focus, as was the reason why they chose the more survival horror approach in the first place, per Bethesda. So what's the frame of reference here for the people that seem to hold it to a standard that they really hadn't likely lived through personally, or if they hadn't really been in style or been used and had evolved into something else for, the better part of 5 or 6 years at the very least? It just doesn't really track for me. I just don't get the sense that the industry even had the street cred or the knowledge of what survival horror meant other than some abstracted gatekeeper definition of what the genre was, and hadn't been in years. Well, maybe it had evolved into action horror, as these games are more about feedback, but they're still definitely revolving around tension and barely escaping by the skin of your teeth. And as for the other complaints, the game's, invisible enemies, one-hit kill sections, and controls can be a pain, but they aren't by any means deal breakers. And I'm amazed at how much people are willing to overlook a multitude of sins in their favorite survival horror games, but are so willing to exaggerate the problems here as if they're so much worse. I'm talking things like the combat in Silent Hill 2, the sometimes finicky aiming and annoying inventory limit causing excessive backtracking in Signalis, The Last of Us's difficult floppy melee and cheap one-hit kill clickers, and the list goes on. Now note, these examples that I just used are about games whose gameplay has flaws, but which the public generally agrees are great, often having very meaningful narratives propping them up, if nothing else. So maybe that's the balm for when a game can piss you off here and there, and you just don't track it the same way. Now don't get me wrong, I don't criticize those to kill the sacred cow. Even if I don't personally like a lot of these games nearly as much as everybody else does, I definitely respect them and I understand why they're important. And one of the main reasons that I assume that people are willing to overlook some of these sort of more finicky, minute, possibly even nitpicky problems with gameplay is that the game on the whole has a much more emotional resonance with them than the average game. And it makes me wonder if the major reason why The Evil Within could never quite get back above water after its initial popularity is that it didn't have quite the emotional resonance of other games with similar gameplay flaws. Certainly, narrative-focused storytelling in games didn't start with Uncharted, but it certainly became much more popular from 2006 on in games like The Last of Us, also made by Naughty Dog, and BioShock Infinite in 2013. These two games specifically really changed gamers' expectations of how much a game would try to connect with them and not just give them some fun gameplay. The Evil Within, relying on archetypal characters, campy melodrama, and mysterious, drip-fed storytelling, likely caused players to recoil because they were starting to get used to stories that were very upfront about what they were about and what they wanted the audience to feel. The Evil Within 2 is remembered fondly for embracing modern storytelling convention like this, though that could also be a function of it being a sequel where most everything was a known quantity now, whereas The Evil Within had a good mystery and an incentive to keep you in the dark until the time is right. But let's get into whether Tango actually capitalized on their good ideas, or whether they missed the mark with their story. Now, I adore the world of The Evil Within, and I found myself rapt with interest as it gradually unfolded its mysteries. But one of the most common complaints about The Evil Within story is that it is very confusing and full of flat, boring characters. Now, to some degree, folks are right to criticize a story that seeks to be far more psychological and gut-wrenching than your average Resident Evil, and then only gives the villain enough depth to be really empathized with. But I'd argue that video games, by definition of their interactive nature, don't require nearly as much narrative oversight as other mediums do, and this is likely why Tango was content to rely on the shorthand of broad archetypes. I'd also contest the idea that the game is really all that confusing. Now yes, the non-linear nature of the clues given can sometimes lead to certain subplots falling through the cracks, but learning how the cause and effect of the world work are really all that matters, and it's really hard to miss this part because there aren't any red herrings or false positives to confuse you as as to who's who in these visions, even if you don't necessarily know the name of the characters, because it eventually all becomes clear who you've been following this whole time. But let's get into the details to prove whether that's the case. Spoilers ahead, so skip to the timestamp on screen if you'd rather get to the general analysis of the story.
All units, 1199, expedite cover code 3, Deacon Mental Hospital.
184 copy, code 3, ETA 3 minutes.
Copy 184.
Sorry, detectives. I know you're just coming off a case, but I'm afraid we're gonna have to make a detour.
Sounds serious.
So, the game opens very RE4 style with Crimson City cops Sebastian, Joseph, and Julie Kidman being driven by a local cop to a bloody crime scene at Beacon Mental Hospital. While investigating the recent massacre of patients and security guards alike, Sebastian and Joseph come upon an addled man in a lab coat mumbling about someone named Ruvik and how this can't be real. It can't be possible.
Can't be real. Impossible. Ruvik.
Sebastian sees what he's referring to in the very Jacob's Ladder-inspired CCTV sequence of a hooded man murdering people at the speed of light. Before Sebastian can investigate further, we see this hooded man appear behind him, and he blacks out, coming to in a nightmare world, the murderous sadist that we mentioned earlier hacking people up nearby. Sebastian barely gets away, and the game proper starts. There's very little context or setup as to how and why Sebastian seems to be in a totally different time or place full of horrible monsters, but the game never asks you to account for it either, only to let Mikami cook and he'll fill you in bit by bit. And that's the mantra we keep coming back to. Chef Mikami knows how to cook, so let him. But if there's any valid criticism of the Evil Within story, it's that Tango doesn't seem to quite know what to do with its protagonist Sebastian Castellanos. He's voiced by Anson Mount, who's actually from my home state of Tennessee. Go Vols!
Let's fucking go Vols!
And he was the best part of that horrible Hell on Wheels show.
Let me spell it out for you, Mr. Campbell.
Unfortunately, Mount does not feel comfortable here, trying way too hard to hide his southern accent and clearly not being directed very well to match the intensity of what he's reacting to. In his defense, his lines are also written in completely goofy understatement.
We must be collectively losing our minds. What is going on here?
Or my favorite.
Maybe I should help you.
Should help you.
Shit. How am I gonna get you to a hospital?
Hospital. 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 Hospital!
What the fuck?
Not only is he written and delivered strangely, but his character arc is largely unrealized despite all the pieces being there for something more interesting. Through a chronological sequence of journal entries that we find in the environment, we see that Sebastian was a Crimson City cop who's happily married to his old partner Myra, and they had a daughter named Lily. But one day, Lily dies in a house fire, but Myra's convinced that it was no accident, and she eventually disappears in the middle of a feverishly obsessive investigation, which Sebastian never truly believes in. When she's gone, Sebastian is driven into alcoholism and acts outside the law in his attempts to find her and follow up on her suspicions. His partner Joseph Oda is his trusted friend, but he reports Sebastian's condition to internal affairs out of concern for Sebastian's well-being. And though these are spread out, these journal entries do give us some insight into Sebastian's backstory, but the man himself only references his past one whole time in-game. He seems almost completely divorced from his own history, and honestly from the situation at hand. It's as if he's being constructed like a silent protagonist. He's not so much a character that we watch as he is an archetype that we inhabit. Chapter 6 is the only time that Sebastian actually has a human conversation with somebody that's not just sort of generic concern or mildly irritated befuddlement like, what's going on here? In this scene, Sebastian and Joseph reflect on their friendship.
Is this what it was like, Seb? After the accident?
Well, I never put a gun to my head.
No, of course not. Just quietly sank into a bottle.
We can't all be perfect. It never affected my work. But hey, you read the IA report.
You know I didn't report you because I was worried about your work, Sebastian.
What else is there?
They clearly respect each other and hold each other accountable, but it's tragic that as good as this scene is, we never see anything more of this interesting dynamic between Joseph's nerdy and sensitive nature and Sebastian's more gruff and to-the-point exterior. The pieces are there for Sebastian to steal the show, but his whole tragic backstory is off-screen melodrama, and according to the art book, he was actually once written as part of the team of men who set fire to the barn where Ruvik and his sister Laura were playing, and this sets off the events of the game. This would have made Sebastian a way more interesting character than he is, and made he and Ruvik's relationship all the more interesting, especially if Ruvik found this out after they got put in this dream world where all their memories are coming to light. But these good ideas were scrapped for something more conventional, and as such, Ruvik steals the show because he's a far more tragic Frankenstein's monster type character gone amok. We're gradually filled in on his backstory through a series of ghostly memories that pop up from time to time, and I'd wager that what people are calling confusing is how these memories, the missing person posters, and the newspaper headlines are conveyed to the player. They're not strictly linear, and it can be kind of hard to follow exactly where in the timeline they go. Notably, there's a plot point about some kind of cult or church back in the day that I've kind of totally missed. In retrospect, they're a bit like Los Illuminados in Resident Evil 4, and there's a bit of a backstory there, some people even saying they might be the prototype of the organization that's behind the events of the Evil Within. But it really gets lost in the sauce, as I'm 4 playthroughs in, and I could barely tell you anything about them. But regardless, it's not super important that you know this much, it's just cooler if you do. The meat of the mystery is who Ruvik is, how his backstory explains why we're stuck in this nightmare world, how it works, and what impact it has on the real world, if any. It's almost as if we're getting messages from the real world when we see all these out-of-order newspaper headlines and missing persons posters, and the picture starts to become clearer and clearer. But notably, the game strings you along in much the same way the whole way through. Sure, things are a little bit out of order, but it's always pointing towards the same plot objective, which becomes pretty much only apparent in the last major scene of the game, which may be a long time to string people along, but you're always inching toward it bit by bit, and you don't have to keep inventory of a whole lot of information because you're always just being slightly updated so that you're not overwhelmed as you go. But I'd imagine that one thing that makes this extra confusing is people trying to figure out how much of this world is real and how much to take seriously so that they can, decide how they feel about it and make predictions about the plot. But our first major red flag that we're definitely not in the real world really at all and don't need to be confused about why weird stuff is happening is when we start realizing that the things the characters are familiar with are materializing in configurations that don't reflect their actual reality as they're remembered, like the hospice where Dr. Marcelo Jimenez's brother Valerio lives. When we go inside, he's turned into a monster, and we have to kill him, but a later visit to a save room shows that Valerio's actually gone missing, almost like we either caused that to happen by killing him, or he's already missing and that's why he's in here with us. It won't make sense back then, but the game keeps going with this motif. Eventually we see that a reporter who was investigating the old church cult has wound up here in our save room asylum. We also see a missing persons poster for him eventually, as we do for Joseph, our partner, and even Tatiana, the nurse that's always here in this area as well. So if all those people are missing, then how are they here? And what does that mean for us if we're in here with them? Now, it's not technically what happened, as a mysterious third party that we'll identify shortly is actually responsible for putting us all in this simulation together. But the spirit of what was being revealed is what we need to be thinking about this whole time. But we're never needing to know exactly the particulars of any of this to make any sense or have any emotional reaction to what's going on. The game is built on dream logic, and it clearly isn't real, as Joseph notes the impossibility of medieval architecture and electricity being together.
Where do you suppose we are?
More like when? This architecture seems straight out of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, but there's electricity. Elevators. This place can't be real.
It's like jumbled up memories.
But the sense of wonder always kept me going to figure out how this fantastical, terrifying world could possibly be. And I didn't need to know in order to appreciate how immersive and diverse it was. It's a bit like what St. Augustine of Hippo once said about his belief in God: I believe in order to know. Applied here, if you play along and have faith that the game is eventually going to satisfy your curiosities, it actually makes it a lot easier to get in lockstep with what the game is going for. And what's more, the villain Ruvik's arc is so compelling that I was always excited to see a new revelation. So we're slow drip-fed visions of Ruvik as a young boy. He experiments on animals with strange Da Vinci-style drawings all around him, and we gradually realize that he's a very bright but a very twisted boy. The only tenderness in his life is towards his sister Laura, his only friend, although it's indicated through his infatuation with her appearance that it's probably a bit possessive too, a bit incestuous because, Japanese fiction.
Anyway,
This idyllic relationship all comes crashing down because of his father's actions. Ruben's father is a wealthy, pious man who gives regularly to Beacon Mental Hospital and also the local church, which is often being investigated for illegal activity and even accused of practicing human sacrifice.
They were promised salvation and eternal life. But there's nothing they could promise that I couldn't take away.
Ruben's father has also been buying up a bunch of land in the area with his wealth, and this incites a mob of angry villagers to burn down one of his barns in revenge. Laura and Ruben were in this barn when it caught ablaze. Laura helps Ruben escape, but she's thought dead in a blood-curdling scream as the blazes consume her, and the burns and trauma of the incident drive Ruben crazy.
Beatrice, please. You must eat. You've got to keep your strength up.
My children. I want...
Beatrice, we have been through...
Even worse, his father tells Ruben's mother that both their children died in the fire, and he locks Ruben in the basement, driving Ruben's twisted psyche further into madness, brewing up even more brutal experiments to make a world where he and his sister can be whole again. Eventually, Ruben escapes the basement, kills both of his parents, staging their death as an accident, and becoming the sole heir to their fortune to pursue his experiments further. He keeps donating to Beacon Mental Hospital as his father did, under the condition that they give him test subjects to experiment on, and soon he partners with Dr. Marcelo Jimenez, who's all too eager to oblige him. Jimenez sees an opportunity to impress his own mysterious benefactors when he learns what Ruben's been working on, a shared consciousness device that allows him to recreate a world with his own mind. And once Jimenez starts to muscle in on this action, this causes a great tension in their relationship, and eventually Jimenez betrays him into the hands of these benefactors to steal the credit for his work and to prove his worth to his overlords.
You wouldn't dare. You couldn't complete it without me.
Precisely.
We find out by game's end that they essentially killed him and now use his brain almost like a battery to charge STEM, and have since been trying to shake Ruvik's influence from the system, but Ruvik's vengeful consciousness actually controls the system, and he keeps killing every test subject that they hook up. We gradually uncover throughout the game that the pale young troubled man named Leslie that we keep seeing is the key to overturning the power structure in STEM. His brainwaves can attune to that of Ruvik's because of his childhood trauma of seeing his parents die in front of him, and he seems to be able to cancel Ruvik out and possibly replace him as the mind and control of STEM. He's also the only patient who's ever been inside STEM and survived.
Wonderful. What does that have to do with any of this?
He's our way out, Detective. Our only way back.
So Jimenez sees fit to use Leslie to rid STEM of Ruvik and impress his benefactors for their nebulous but clearly nefarious ends. Julie Kidman, the young protege of Sebastian and Joseph at the KCPD, also seems to be questioning some undercover directive that she's acting on from some unknown organization, very a la Ada Wong, as she clearly doesn't want to hurt anybody but seems ready to kill Leslie to overturn some bad side effect that we're not quite sure about. We find out by game's end that Ruvik actually needs Leslie's body to escape the system and get back into the real world, and he does so, despite Sebastian defeating his presence in STEM. The game ends with everyone waking up realizing they've all been hooked up to STEM this whole time, or almost the whole time, that we've been captured and reported missing for some time now. Though this mad experiment is now over, nearly everyone is dead except Kidman, who saves Sebastian from her benefactor's clutches at the last moment. Unfortunately, in the distance we see Leslie walking away and he phases out, giving Sebastian one last ringing headache, which is just like what's been happening to him in STEM. Is he actually out of STEM? Or is Ruvik now simply able to warp the world around him now that he's free of its bounds? It's a chilling cliffhanger that's not been answered to this day, which is definitely something I'll be theory crafting around in an Evil Within 3 video later this year. So that's a pretty cool story, right? We have a classic, twisted, but slightly innocent boy who finally snaps when his whole world is taken from him, and that becomes the driving factor of justifying more and more atrocities. Jimenez's tragic hubris is really the reason that all of this is happening in the first place, having jacked he and Leslie into the system in an attempt to drive Ruvik out once for all, and make the STEM system his crowning achievement. But Sebastian and friends are there to drive out the monsters that manifest in Ruvik's mind, like the Keeper, who's styled to look like the lockbox where he kept his notes away from Jimenez, who kept stealing his work and the credit for it, and Laura is clearly the manifestation of Ruvik's grief at her supposed death. It's all very Silent Hill by way of the Matrix, and it makes sense intuitively in a dream logic kind of way, even if the game doesn't do a very good job of explaining the symbolism of the monsters outside of the art book. But despite all this, you're never really on the hook for any of this deep lore information. It'd be nice if it was there and more direct, but Ruvik's arc is easy enough to follow, and it's really the centerpiece that you need to pay attention to, and that's delivered pretty compellingly. Now, I imagine that people are responding negatively to how his backstory is presented in a non-chronological order, but there are no red herrings or false positives here to worry about. Every ghostly memory is about him in a different stage in his life, and them being slightly out of order reflects the precarious disorder of how we fleetingly remember things anyway when searching through our own memory banks. And it makes it all the more fun to try and decipher these slightly disjointed pieces so that we can figure out who Ruvik actually is. Telling it chronologically wouldn't have been as interesting, nor would it have felt so haunting. The main story arc is all there, and all the information I just gave you is what I knew after my first playthrough before the DLCs ever came out to clear things up even more and add some really cool context. But that was just the icing on the cake. Everything that you need to care about what's going on is here, and it's done in a compelling way. But if you are someone who's really interested in knowing all the ins and outs, the DLCs do a much better job of being direct. In the Assignment and Consequence DLCs, we control Kidman, and she plays a lot like Ashley in RE4, with her usually weaponless stealth sections and flashlight, and she also functions as the story's Ada Wong, down to her high heels and double agent lifestyle. She's also very well voice acted by Jennifer Carpenter, who wonderfully played Deb on my favorite show Dexter. She turns out a far better performance than Anson Mount does in the main game. She also has a way cooler way of saving her game progress. She'll sit down on a red couch, and a black cat will jump on her lap. And no lie, my black cat Maynard jumped onto my work desk as I was saving one time, and I just had to take this picture. But adorable anecdotes aside, it turns out that the reason that Kidman's motivations made no real sense in the main game was because she was here undercover for Mobius, an evil umbrella-like organization that Jimenez was beholden to and whom he betrayed Ruvik to. Kidman's sent in to retrieve their most valued asset in Leslie, who's capable of running STEM by himself if given a Ruvik-free system. Mobius hopes to use his impressionable mind for their own ends of controlling the world via a shared consciousness model, much like Ruvik's prototype. But the problem is that Ruvik locks him to his own brainwaves so that it doesn't work at all without him. So they eviscerate his body and hook him back up to STEM, but can't seem to shake his influence from it, his locked-in brainwaves, which causes them to get frustrated with Jimenez, and which causes him to do a Hail Mary test run by jacking he and Leslie into the system using a new wireless STEM prototype that can pull people into the shared consciousness remotely, which is the ringing that Seb, Kidman, and Joseph hear at the very beginning of the game, and which transforms their driver's consciousness into madness and sets in motion the events of the game. The storytelling is very direct in the DLC, always coming from memories we see played out or from direct dialogue with the administrator, who's the big bad of Mobius. It's a cleanup stage for the story of the main game, which was murky at times, because it was meant to reflect how disorienting this world would be for Sebastian and the rest of the cast.
By the time I realized Jimenez had betrayed me, it was too late.
Now, people saying the story is confusing aren't technically wrong, but it's almost like if the story's not making itself abundantly clear to people like, say, The Last of Us and BioShock Infinite might, they tune it out and assume that the game doesn't care about engaging them, when, to me, it was the exact opposite. It was like the game was beckoning me to pay more attention because it was being slightly withholding with the information. Much like its nods to RE4 and the twist of Shutter Island and Inception, The Evil Within's collection of pop culture tropes makes it more predictable, not less so, and it makes the mystery comprehensible and not really that confusing after all if you just pay attention to what these tropes normally mean and what they're used for. The parts that are wild and a little confusing, perhaps, are dream logic. And most of it's just done for fun. You know, the weird transitions, the jarring, abrupt changes in the environment. And it's clear that they don't need to be accounted for mentally. As we're reminded time and again by the characters themselves that this isn't real, we gradually start to see the big picture come into focus, and it becomes really satisfying by the end. So while the game is definitely a little ambitious to presume that you can remember all the details over the course of its 17 hours or so, if you were honestly investing yourself in the lore and the collectibles, you would be able to recite the plot back to me just as I have to you. But I'm inclined to think that no matter how well The Evil Within fulfilled its own goals as a compelling mystery built on dream logic, the fact that it didn't fit in with the current industry trends in storytelling may have doomed its reputation from the outset. The industry had been moving towards narrative being front and center, and gameplay being more like struts to support it. Games like Uncharted had really popularized this approach, and I think this trend really leveled up with BioShock Infinite and The Last of Us in 2013. Now there's wisdom in this approach, it certainly makes the player more invested in what's going on, but The Evil Within being campy and a slow burn mystery probably didn't work too well for what people were getting used to for things that didn't have the name Resident Evil on the cover. Expectations can color everything, and few games can escape the jaws of hype or unrealistic, unfounded expectations if you think that something should be a certain way before it's even in your hands. That's partially RE4's fun-loving and low-maintenance legacy unavoidably tampering with proper expectations of The Evil Within.
Are you serious? It's a fucking nightmare.
Well, I didn't say it was perfect.
But there's also the fact that The Evil Within is not constantly prodding the player on and keeping them abreast of why they should care at regular intervals. Players probably started to feel like they weren't being attended to, in ways that Red Dead Redemption 2, The Last of Us, Ghost of Tsushima, and the rest of its ilk do. None of them really have world-class gameplay, and they're rarely praised for it, but they're treasured for the feel of their worlds and the depth of their stories. The Evil Within not requiring a lot of emotional investment even for its melodramatic tragedy, while having us fight outrageous B-movie monsters, probably felt to some like a betrayal of both modern gaming's narrative innovations, while also not being silly enough in accordance with its campiness. But I'd argue that's kind of part of the 2010s edgelord's fun, part of the point. If anything, it's elevating what would likely just be like a slasher movie into something a little more somber and moody and poetic in a way. But this approach is also a product of its time, as edgy schlock horror was still very much in vogue in the 2010s, what with all those remakes of Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. In fact, I'd easily guess that not only was Ruvik's serial killer background, burns, and the ability to influence people's dreamscapes completely inspired by Freddy Krueger, but that Ruvik's voice actor Jackie Earle Haley was likely considered for the role because he played Freddy in the 2010 remake. Now, that's not to say that The Evil Within isn't all over the place in terms of set-piece design. It has RE4's throw everything at the wall mentality, but in overdrive. You see just about every type of action set-piece of the RE5, 6, and Dead Space era, in some form, plus a zillion more. So while it's technically true that the game is jumping around a lot, it's also dead-ass obvious that this is the point of the world. It's the fun of it. There's no reason to get attached to these external things, just enjoy getting to play in so many different types of horror setups in the same game. All that to say, I don't feel like The Evil Within is technically all that confusing, though it is a game about confusion, and it was definitely conceived in a state of creative flux that had to make some concessions to make it less so. And that can make The Evil Within feel like it's wild and sometimes intimidating, and it just feels like it was perhaps made in the wrong decade. The intentionally jarring shifts between environments through hazy transitions and all the mind-bending effects weren't that commonplace back in 2014. Alan Wake 4 years earlier was the clearest analog and possibly even inspired The Evil Within, as his flashlight mechanics of shining lights to reveal objects was lifted in Kidman's DLC episodes. But Alan Wake 2 took it a step further, and I remember specifically thinking, man, that looks a lot like the way The Evil Within would have done that, in that subway scene with all the red glow and the papers flying everywhere. And sure enough, I'm having trouble finding the tweet now, but I know I read that it was either Clay Murphy or Thomas Pua that said that The Evil Within 2 was a specific influence on the team while they were making Alan Wake 2. Alan Wake 2 is just full of visceral, bloody, and jarring screen effects that feel like they got some of their edge from The Evil Within. I also noticed that Watch Dogs Legion likely took some inspiration from the giant barbed wire brain and Ruvik himself with the Sky Larson quest. This quest keeps showing you this big red brain, and a very pale Ruvik-looking woman can be allowed to live, or you can kill her in suspended animation behind glass, much like you can do with Ruvik's brain hooked up to STEM. Even games like the excellent Alone in the Dark 2024 remake feel like they learned a thing or two from The Evil Within, shifting between memory-based worlds and then back to reality before you even know it. I also find it very funny that the RE4 remake seems to have taken the chainsaw blade reverse move that Sebastian does in The Evil Within 2 and made it an actual mechanic where Leon can block attacks with his knife, even the chainsaw. And let's not forget how the remake also added in that very Evil Within-esque stealth system out of nowhere into a series that's never had this option. So to me, The Evil Within's always been ahead of its time, not outdated. Perhaps a little too indebted to the copying of RE5's turret sections and forcing too many clunky fights against gunmen in the daytime sequences, but still profoundly immersive when it's leaning into its castles and dungeons and mansions and catacombs and forests, lit only by pyres of the burning dead. But as much as I defended The Evil Within here today, even Mikami himself had some misgivings about how the game turned out when given the chance to reflect. Like we said earlier, when Mikami can't think of a new idea, he returns to his roots. And that's what happened with The Evil Within, albeit with pressure from Bethesda that he directly compete with Resident Evil, the series that he'd made great in the first place. Perhaps this spurred him on to be competitive and nostalgic in a way that he wouldn't have otherwise if his preference for brand new ideas had felt more flexible and had better come to fruition. Mikami said,
"It's regretful that the back to roots concept got through. We should have aimed at something new in horror. I missed my calculations here a bit and stayed on my roots, the old way. Good or bad, this is how that game ended up."
Now, despite how unspecific this is still pretty telling, and I think it's a great indicator that Mikami is self-aware that he may have just had to make the game this way because he knew no other way. So did Mikami mess up and I'm just a fanboy blinded by a decade of nostalgia? I don't think so. I love The Evil Within as much now as I did a decade ago, and since then we've seen some of the greatest action or survival horror games ever made in Alan Wake 2, Resident Evil 2 Remake, RE7, and 8, if I'm being honest. Yes, I love that game. And the Dead Space and Silent Hill 2 remakes. The Evil Within just keeps aging better and better as it feels more and more in line with these types of great, epic, well-polished experiences. Now, of course, The Evil Within's exacting design can be frustrating, and its story a bit unwieldy and underdeveloped, but almost every single criticism levied at this game feels overblown or at least overemphasized as a deal breaker. More the years pass, the more it stands up as being its own type of weird, totally doing its own thing type of game that holds up against all these great remakes and new entries in these established series that it's competing with. There are just too many overriding factors like its loving homages to generations of horror classics, the interplay between resource management and combat and stealth, the epic set pieces and boss fights, the gorgeous art design, cinematography and music, and the thrilling rush of getting past obstacles by the skin of your teeth. And if you enjoy what makes games great, then you're likely to enjoy The Evil Within. I think Bruce Lee summed it up well.
How did it feel to you?
Let me think.
Don't think. Feel. It is like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all that heavenly glory.
Evil Within fans are generally uncomplicated and unpretentious about why they respond to this game. They seem more open to what it's doing and less judgmental and nitpicky about every detail not completely making sense as soon as it enters their brain. But more so than hanging out in the survival horror's ivory tower looking down my nose at The Evil Within, I would much rather be hanging out with the people that celebrate this awesome accomplishment of Shinji Mikami and the rest of Tango Gameworks. So, a big thanks to Tango, and I wish you guys the best in your future endeavors at crafting, and a big thanks to all that Mikami-san has given us over the years, and for me especially, thank you so much for giving me one of my very favorite games in The Evil Within. And as Shinji Mikami would probably say,
"You're welcome."
Thank you.
And now let's do the first segment of Further Reading, where I recommend some similar media to the game I'm covering so that you can get more of this if you liked what you saw here. I also recommend Alone in the Dark 2008. It features a gruff protagonist who also gets to use fire quite a bit to vanquish his zombie enemies, and this game takes place in a city that's basically falling apart by an impossibly violent earthquake, which is very similar to the way that The Evil Within's world is falling apart. I know Mikami was very upfront about how inspired he was by Inception, but Inception never had this level of destruction, so I'd imagine that he had to have taken some pointers from yet another Alone in the Dark game here. I'd also recommend the Suffering games. Both games feature convict Torque fending off Silent Hill-esque monsters that are manifestations generated from the torturous experiments in the prison in the first game, or the streetwise mishaps like drug addiction in the second game set in Baltimore. It's definitely action horror, being almost entirely run-and-gun third-person shooting, but it captures that same feeling of being in a grungy, lived-in world that's full of nightmarish, symbolic monsters, much like The Evil Within does. But there's more than just games that recall The Evil Within, so I'd like to recommend really cool things in film that I found. So the makers of the excellent German time travel show Dark on Netflix came back for one season of a new show called 1899 before it was canceled. Now, for spoilery reasons, I can't tell you just how similar it is to The Evil Within. but you can at least get right back into that anachronistic, this world is not what it seems feeling here, as characters struggle to figure out how their 19th century life aboard a ship is fraught with these supernatural or science fiction-y perils. And holy hell, does the main male protagonist look like Sebastian with his beard, brown vest and pants, and all that mess. Very cool, and one of my biggest, tip-offs that this feels at least Evil Within inspired. I'd also recommend the small-budget Canadian movie called The Void. If you thought The Evil Within was confusing and bad at storytelling, well, The Void can't commit to its characters' backstories or motivations for very long, but much like The Evil Within, it's about the ride and not necessarily worth trying to pin down all the whys of why everybody's doing what they do. Our main character is a cop with an estranged wife after the death of their son, and he's got to wrestle with some unruly characters as they try to save a hospital that's under siege by a cult led by a pinhead-looking dude that can turn people into Lovecraft monsters. It's a practical effects masterpiece, and it's full of all this shotgun action against unholy monsters. Oh, and fire. Lots of fire. It's so Evil Within coded, as it's messy, but definitely got the makings of a cult classic. And last but not least, the most Evil Within-y movie that I can possibly recommend to you is probably Apostle on Netflix, where a dude goes off to rescue a kidnapped woman from an island cult and finds out what they worship the hard way. It's excessively gory and gross and brutal, very slasher horror meets torture porn, hiding from monsters and supernatural evil women that'll mess you up. All the stuff that you would come to expect and appreciate in an Evil Within game, so check this one out too. Before I go, I'd like to give a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by becoming a patron. Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Halcyon Loon, Hey Blondie, Hey Aksho, M, BBF and Bloxburg, and Melancholy Geek. And an extra special thank you to those of you donating at my highest paid tiers, The Nth Review and James Wyatt. Now, if you'd like to keep what few lights I have on, you should join these folks at patreon.com/midnightmedium or become a YouTube channel member or donate at Ko-fi or PayPal. Also check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to support me with no extra cost to you. And if you aren't tired of me yet, check me out as I join Deadforge and Robert Yap in the Quad Damage podcast, where we talk first-person shooters with developers and content creators alike. God bless you everyone, and I'll see you soon.